Welcome to Very Nearly Interesting. You are most welcome. As part of our Birth of the Beatles series, we've come back to Liverpool and back to Woolton, where the historic meeting of John Lennon and Paul McCartney took place. This episode is jam-packed. We're going back to the scene where the Quarrymen, the early incarnation of the Beatles, first played. And we're going to investigate whether Paul McCartney was in the crowd on that day before they even met. John Lennon was playing with the Quarrymen at Toxteth on the 22nd of June 1957. We're going to analyse a fascinating photograph by Charlie Roberts, a friend of early Quarryman Colin Hanton. We're even going to find out where the Quarrymen name came from. We'll visit the school that inspired that name. And you're going to be the first people ever online to hear the song that originally inspired the Beatles. Okay, the Quarrymen, but it's the same thing. Because really, when you see the name Quarrymen, you should read the word Beatles. John Lennon didn't leave the Quarrymen to join the Beatles. The Quarrymen evolved into the Beatles. John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison were all Quarrymen. It just so happened that they survived the cuts before they changed the name. So the Quarrymen really was basically the Beatles before they settled on the final lineup. St. Peter's Church Hall is behind me, but we're not going in there today. That's where the historic meeting between John Lennon and Paul McCartney took place. In that hall. We've already made a video showing the exact spot where John Lennon and Paul McCartney met, making history on the 6th of July 1957. If you missed it, don't worry. There'll be a link on the end screen of this video so you can watch it, and there'll also be a link pinned in the comments. Watching this video first actually makes that video make more sense and gives the Lennon and McCartney meeting a little bit more context. In this video, I want to go back a little bit further than the events that happened in there. So, this is a prequel. If you're a Beatles fan, don't go anywhere. If you're not a Beatles fan, you don't go anywhere either. Don't you even dream of touching that dial. In 1207, King John of England did a good thing. He founded the borough of Liverpool. 1957 marked the 750th anniversary of that wonderful moment. Liverpudlians don't need much excuse to throw a party. And in 1957, there were street parties throughout Liverpool. A particularly memorable party was held in Toxteth at Rosebery Street, where a certain Charlie Roberts lived. Charlie was a friend of early quarryman Colin Hanton, and he booked the Quarrymen for the Rosebery Street party. Using Charlie's own words, this was the Quarrymen's first documented gig. No money changed hands on that day. The Quarrymen did it just for fun, and I assume to get some experience of playing in front of a live crowd. They will have been rehearsing and playing in front of friends and family in the months leading up to this gig. They played on the back of a flatbed coal lorry outside Charlie's house on Rosebery Street. Rosebery Street was sadly demolished in the 1970s, but that's where we're going to next. And here I am at Rosebery Street. So if we go along here, this is quite a short street and doesn't bear any resemblance to how the street used to look. But roughly, in the middle of this street is the site of the Quarrymen's very first gig. On the 22nd of June 1957. And that spot is about here, in the middle of Rosebery Street. This is the approximate location of Charlie Roberts' house. The coal lorry would have been about here. The Quarrymen would have been at the top of it. The cables from the amps would have gone through the window to Charlie Roberts' mother's front room. I'm going to get out of the middle of the street now because this is a residential area. I'm now on a private property just off Rosebery Street. One of the local residents has very kindly allowed me to use his garden. Opposite is the approximate location of Charlie Roberts' mother's house. It's only a short street, but here's where history happened. This gig took place exactly 2 weeks before the Lennon and McCartney meeting, 2 weeks later on the 6th of July 1957. The next street along is Hatherley Street. One side of the street has got modern housing on it, but the other side is identical to Rosebery Street. That's going to give us an idea as to how Rosebery Street would have looked in 1957. The houses were all built at the same time, presumably by the same builder. These houses have the same brickwork, same archways, same bay windows that we see at Rosebery Street prior to demolition in the 70s. Charlie tells us that local lads didn't take too kindly to John winking at their girlfriends, and the mood is said to have turned a little bit ugly. Actually, he might not have been winking, he might have been squinting because he wasn't wearing his glasses. That's not cool. Sensing the mood changing and before anything kicked off, the Quarrymen jumped off the truck and took refuge at Charlie's house over the road, where they enjoyed his mother's hospitality for an hour. And then they all went home. So we have Charlie to thank for this gig and the photographic record that we have of that day. Charlie went on to be a graphic designer, and he even designed the graphics for the Quarrymen's bass drum. Now, this photograph is not as famous as the photograph that was taken 2 weeks later at Woolton. Hopefully this video will contribute in some small way to this photograph becoming just a little bit more famous. But it should be more famous for one possibly overlooked reason. Is this Paul McCartney inadvertently photographed in the crowd? There are mixed views on the subject. We need to do a deep dive and take a look at the evidence. This is one of 3 photos taken by Charlie that day. He'd borrowed a camera, and these were the first photos he'd ever taken. The photo is interesting enough, given that it's a live Quarrymen gig prior to Lennon meeting McCartney. But in chat rooms and blogs, armchair detectives are transfixed on this character in the bottom right-hand corner. Is this McCartney? Many dismiss the idea for 2 main reasons. Certainly at first glance, it doesn't much look like him. And besides, Paul doesn't wear glasses. But here's the evidence that this could be Paul. The bike. Paul cycled everywhere in 1957. There's irrefutable proof that he cycled to Woolton Village on the 6th of July 1957, the day he met John. Multiple eyewitnesses said so. Paul wasn't a local lad, so he did need a bike. Woolton is a 13-minute bike ride from his home at 20 Forthlin Road. Toxteth, where this photo was taken, is a 19-minute bike ride. All the lads in this photograph would be local lads, except this guy. Have a look at how he's standing. Look at his gait. Why are his arms outstretched? And why is his back arched in that way? Could he be standing astride his bike? I think he is. He cycled from Forthlin Road to watch the gig, and the bike is still underneath him. He'll have known about this gig from their mutual friend Ivan Vaughan, who was to introduce them 2 weeks later. He's holding the handlebars and he's standing astride the frame of the bike. That was a busy street party and there would have been nowhere safe to leave his bike, so he kept it with him. Let's look at this character's height. Paul is over 5'11". The average height of males in England in the 50s was 5'7". This fits. This man is significantly taller than the rest of the crowd, even with his legs splayed over the bike. Paul did wear glasses. Buddy Holly had made the look quite cool, and whilst we don't see Paul wearing glasses in the Beatles, there's plenty of photos pre-Beatles of him wearing glasses. The jacket. This guy is wearing a very light jacket. Everyone else has dark clothing. Paul was well known for wearing his favourite light-coloured jacket with a metallic glistening thread. This is Paul on the beach in that same year, 1957, wearing what I think is the same jacket. He was famously and irrefutably wearing a light-coloured jacket 2 weeks after this photograph was taken at his meeting with Lennon at the Woolton Church Fete. Let's have a good look at his face. It's in profile and he's wearing glasses, which makes it hard. But this could be Paul. In fact, the more you look at the photograph, the more it looks like him. To my knowledge, no one has ever shown this photo to Paul, but I think we're looking at history here. If I was interviewing McCartney, this is the first thing I'd ask him. This is McCartney 2 weeks before he ever met John. Straight after this gig, he'll have turned his bike around and pedalled back to Forthlin Road. That's definitely McCartney. I've studied that photograph for longer than is healthy. When I first looked at it, I dismissed it along with many other people. But then I returned to it. That face belongs to Paul McCartney. If you stare at it long enough, McCartney's face reveals itself to you. Pause this video, zoom in, and just stare at that face. The glasses throw a lot of people off, but he did wear glasses. And I think he was on his bike, just like he was on his bike a fortnight later when he went to the garden fete at Woolton. And I think that's the same jacket he wore 2 weeks later at the meeting with Lennon in Woolton. Everything fits. I'm going to say that that's Paul McCartney seeing John for the first time ever before they met 2 weeks later. Charlie Roberts has inadvertently captured a very, very special moment in history, and we should be forever indebted to him for that. Paul did say in a 1960s interview that he had seen John play before he met him, but he offered a less than plausible date and location. Paul is notoriously vague when it comes to history, and he admits himself that he can't be relied upon for factual, accurate historical information. Certainly when it comes to dates. He often can't tell you an approximate year that he wrote a song. I'm going to say here and now that that's McCartney. And that's the first time he laid eyes on Lennon. And that's history inadvertently caught on camera. We need to go back a little further now to Quarrybank High School for boys. John Lennon started his band back in 1956 and originally called it the Blackjacks. But before they played their first gig, they changed their name to the Quarrymen. We're not sure whether we've got Quarryman Pete Shotton or John Lennon to thank for the name Quarrymen, but we do know where the name came from. It was from here, this school behind me. It's now called Calderstone School, but back in 1956, this was Quarrybank High School for boys, and this is where John Lennon went to as a boy. It opened in 1922, and the very first headmaster was an old Etonian by the name of Mr. F.R. Bailey. This guy was quite multi-talented. He'd got into Eton after all, and he was chosen by this school to be their very first head teacher. He was also the man that would inspire the naming of the band that would become the Beatles. It was Bailey who coined the school's motto, Hex Hoc Metello Virtutem, which means courage, honour and service. And he clearly wanted this motto to be in the school song itself, so he decided to compose it himself. These songs are much more common in public schools like Eton. For our American audience, a public school in England is a private school that's very, very expensive. Actual public schools in England are called state schools, amongst other things. Quarrybank High School was a state school. Bailey would have been well aware of the local history at Woolton. Woolton Quarries had been producing stone here since the Victorian times, and it was a major source of income for the village of Woolton and the surrounding areas. Noting the toil and labour that went into quarrying in the Victorian times, he obviously wanted to imbue that work ethic into his new pupils. So he penned the song, and a colleague wrote the music. The first line of the song: Quarrymen old before our birth, straining each muscle and sinew, toiling together Mother Earth, conquered the rock that was in you. Stirring words, and that song would have been sang by John Lennon and his bandmates at every single morning assembly. But what did the song sound like, and how did it go? I'm glad you've asked, because I've had it recorded just for you. Ladies and gentlemen, the song of the quarry.
Quarrymen all before our birth, straining each muscle and sinew, toiling together Mother Earth, conquered the rock that was in you. Saying and quarrying all is done, readily we'll refute 'em. We are the quarry of school, our stone, Hox and Metallo Virtutem. Stand we together, rank on rank, sing we thy praising chorus. Quarry of manhood, quarry bank, rock of the lives before us.
Sadly, that man died having no idea what he started. If you've enjoyed this video, please give us a like. It really does help in the distribution of the video so more people can see it. Here's the link of the video I was telling you about, and you'll see exactly the spot where John Lennon and Paul McCartney met on the 6th of July 1957. And please consider subscribing. That way we might see you again. We're not just a Beatles channel, we're like anything that's interesting, or very nearly interesting.